The dolls that left at midnight. Just after midnight, a soft knock echoed through an empty street, and a hand-painted wooden doll stood alone on a porch, its tag marked with a name no one in town had ever heard. Hours later, another appeared at the abandoned mill where an assault had gone unsolved for nearly 20 years, placed upright as though someone wanted it found. What followed pulled old loyalties out of the dark and revealed something the town had buried for decades. A faint knock echoes on a quiet street just after midnight. A wooden doll, no taller than a hand, waits on a porch under the porch light, painted, tagged with a name that doesn't exist in any household record. 2 streets over, another appears the same night, and by the time the sun rises, no one can say who placed them or why they were left at all. The first sightings began in the autumn of 2017 in the small coastal town of Ridge Harbor, Washington. It was the kind of place built around routine, fishermen heading out before dawn, locals gathering at the cafe on Harbor Street, and a neighborhood where everyone claimed to know everybody else. The arrival of the dolls didn't cause alarm at first. Residents assumed it was some kind of art project, or maybe a child playing a game. But the details didn't fit those explanations for long. The dolls were made from carved wood, each hand-painted in muted earth tones. They had delicate brushwork around the eyes, tiny joints at the elbows and knees, and clothes stitched from scraps of linen. What no one could figure out was the names. Every doll had a paper tag tied around its neck with twine. Each tag carried a name written in small block letters, names that didn't belong to anyone who lived in Ridge Harbor. The first doll belonged to the front porch of Henry and Linda Graves. Henry found it around 5:40 a.m. as he left for work. The tag read, Mara. Henry didn't think much of it, but his wife later mentioned it to their next-door neighbor, who had found one too. That doll's tag read Ellis. By evening, 3 more houses reported similar finds. By itself, the event might have faded into a passing oddity, but the pattern changed on the 4th night. Around 12:15 a.m., a jogger named Dana Wilkes noticed someone standing near the broken fence behind the old redwood textile mill. The mill had been abandoned for almost 20 years, and it sat beside the wooded trail where Dana ran after her night shifts. She didn't approach the figure. All she saw was the silhouette of someone leaning down to set something on the ground, then leaving in silence. The next morning, officers found a doll at the base of the fence. It was positioned upright, facing the tree line. Its tag read, Wren. The strange part wasn't the doll's presence. It was the location. In 1998, the Redwood textile mill was the scene of a violent assault. A 16-year-old named Holly Mercer had been found unconscious behind that same fence. She survived, but she left Ridge Harbor the following year and never returned. The case had never been solved. The connection wasn't obvious at first, but when word spread that a doll now sat at the site of that old crime, older residents felt the unease return. Detective Samuel Hart, who had joined the Ridge Harbor Police Department only a few months before the dolls appeared, became the lead investigator. In interviews years later, he described the case as quietly disorienting, the kind of mystery that grows in small increments, too slow to notice until it suddenly feels larger than everything around it. Hart's first step was to collect the dolls and send them to the state forensic lab. Analysts examined the wood, paint, and fabric. The wood came from Douglas fir, local to the region. The paint was acrylic, common and easily purchased. The fabric scraps didn't match anything unusual. No fingerprints, no DNA traces, no stray hair or skin cells. Whoever made them had worn gloves and handled them carefully. But there was one technical detail that stood out. Each tag was written on the same type of paper, an archival-grade parchment, thicker than normal craft paper. The handwriting appeared to be printed, not cursive, and every letter had consistent spacing. A handwriting expert concluded the tags were written by the same person, likely someone practiced in uniform lettering. Still, none of this explained the names. Detective Hart and his team ran database searches for missing persons, birth records, death certificates, and regional directories. None of the names matched anything relevant. They weren't anagrams, they weren't local references, or they didn't appear in any historical registry connected to Ridge Harbor. 2 weeks after the first doll appeared, the case widened. A resident named Thomas Lockwood came forward with something he had kept to himself. His father, who had been a security guard at the textile mill in the late 1990s, used to mention a group of local men who would meet after hours in a back storage room. Thomas said his father called them the Harbor Circle. He never described them as dangerous, just secretive. They were older men from respected families, people who held long-standing influence in town life.
Detective Hart started quietly asking around. Older officers remembered the group vaguely. A retired town clerk recalled hearing rumors about them decades ago, although she believed they were more of a social club than anything else. Still, as the dolls continued appearing, something about the pattern suggested intention rather than coincidence. The next major shift in the investigation came from a young couple living on Harborview Road. They had received 2 dolls in the span of 3 nights. The second doll had been positioned differently, leaning against their doorframe, as though deliberately placed to be found immediately. Detective Hart interviewed the couple. They didn't recognize the names on the tags, Tamsin and Rowe. An hour after Hart left, the couple called him back. They had found something else tucked under the welcome mat, a small piece of parchment cut in a similar shape as the name tags, but this one contained no name. Instead, it held a date. April 4, 1998. The same day Holly Mercer was assaulted behind the textile mill. For the first time, Hart considered the possibility that the dolls were not random gifts or a strange art installation. They might be messages, markers, left for reasons no one had yet understood. Hart returned to the Redwood Textile Mill archives, searching through old interviews, police notes, and statements taken the night Holly was found injured. Several men were questioned back then, but released due to lack of evidence. One of the names that came up repeatedly was a man named Neil Forrester, a well-liked local fisherman who had died in 2011. Another was Michael Dan, the son of a former town council member. There were 5 names total, all men, all in their late teens or 20s at the time. All eventually released. Hart noticed a minor detail in the old file, a list of initials scribbled by an officer who had since moved out of state. The initials didn't match any of the names of the suspects. When Hart tracked the officer down and asked about them, the former officer remembered only one thing. The initials referred to a community agreement, something he believed was related to the men who used the back room at the mill. He didn't think it was criminal, more like an old tradition no one talked about openly. The more Hart learned, the more the dolls seemed connected to a shared past rather than a current threat. 3 days later, the investigation took another turn. A local teacher named Evelyn Shore walked into the station carrying a shoebox. Inside were 2 wooden dolls nearly identical to the others. She explained that her late brother Daniel had made dolls like these throughout their childhood. Daniel had struggled with depression and had moved away years earlier. He died in 2015. Evelyn wasn't sure if his old work had anything to do with the ones appearing around town, but she thought the resemblance was worth mentioning. Hart compared Daniel's childhood dolls to the new ones. There were similarities, the jointed limbs, the muted paint colors, but Daniel's craftsmanship was rougher, less refined. The new dolls showed a level of skill that suggested long practice. Evelyn also mentioned something else. When she and Daniel were younger, their father used to tell them that certain families in Ridge Harbor looked out for one another in ways outsiders didn't understand. She didn't know if it meant anything, but it stayed with her over the years. Hart began mapping the locations where the dolls had been left. When viewed on a larger map of Ridge Harbor, the placement formed a wide ring around the town center, excluding only the oldest part of town, where the families associated with the rumored Harbor Circle once lived. The positioning seemed deliberate, as if someone was marking off boundaries or symbolically pointing inward. Winter arrived, and the dolls didn't stop. One appeared every few nights, sometimes two at once, always left at midnight or shortly after, always silent. The names kept changing: Bran, Lyran, Maven, Isola. Over time, a subtle pattern emerged. Each name contained letters that matched the initials Hart had found in the old officer's notes, not perfectly, but often enough to raise questions. In January, a break came from an unexpected angle. A man named Christopher Hale, a former resident who had moved to Oregon years earlier, contacted Hart after hearing about the case through relatives. Christopher said something that shifted the entire direction of the investigation. He claimed that in the early 2000s, there was a rumor about a pact between several respected families in Ridge Harbor. According to him, the pact formed after a night gone wrong, involving younger members of those families. The agreement was said to protect everyone involved from scandal, police involvement, or public attention. Christopher didn't know the specifics, but he said one family eventually broke ties with the others. Tension followed, and within a year, the textile mill closed permanently. Christopher didn't know who started the pact, but he mentioned something Hart found unusual. One of the families had a tradition of carving small wooden figures for their children. The practice went back generations. Hart asked for names. Christopher hesitated, but eventually gave one: the Forrester family. The same family whose son, Neil, was questioned after Holly Mercer's assault in 1998. Detective Hart returned to the mill one cold morning in February. Snow covered the ground, melting in patches around the old fence. He walked the perimeter, trying to picture how someone could move silently enough to leave a doll without being noticed. Behind the fence, he found something he hadn't seen before: a small pile of shaved wood curls, the kind created when carving by hand. They were fresh.
The discovery suggested that someone might be carving the dolls nearby, possibly in the abandoned structure. Hart requested permission to enter the building, and a small team accompanied him. Inside, the air was thick with dust. Old machinery sat rusting in the corners. They searched the rooms one by one. Nothing appeared unusual until they reached the back storage room. Against the wall sat an old workbench. On top were faint scratches in the shape of lines, arcs, and notches. They weren't recent, but they resembled knife marks, the kind created by someone carving wood. Hart also found a small piece of linen tucked between the boards of the bench. It matched the cloth used on the doll's clothing. It became clear that whoever was leaving the dolls had access to the mill. They might even have known about the old Harbor Circle meetings held there decades earlier. The story that emerged was no longer just about dolls. It was about memory, secrecy, and retribution, quiet and calculated. As March arrived, the dolls stopped appearing for nearly 10 days. Residents believed the incident had ended, but on the 11th night, a final doll appeared on the steps of the town library. This one was different. The paint was darker, the clothing more carefully stitched, and the tag contained not a name, but a full sentence. The truth was shared by those who hid it. Detective Hart saw it as a message aimed at the families connected to the old Harbor Circle meetings held there decades earlier. When he asked around discreetly, several elderly residents admitted they had heard whispers years ago, stories of an agreement that protected the sons of certain families after a violent encounter behind the mill. No one had proof, but everyone knew the assault on Holly Mercer had ended abruptly, with no charges filed and no further questioning. Some said Holly had been pressured to stay silent. Others said her family simply wanted to leave Ridge Harbor behind. The investigation never uncovered definitive evidence linking the dolls to any living member of the Forrester family or the others rumored to be in the Harbor Circle. There were no fingerprints, no sightings, no confessions. The dolls stopped as abruptly as they began. Over time, the town grew quieter about the subject. Most of the dolls were stored as evidence. A few residents kept theirs, unsure whether they represented a warning, an apology, or something else entirely. Detective Hart later described the case as one of the unsettling ones, not because it was unsolved, but because it hinted at a truth everyone sensed, but no one could fully prove. A long-hidden agreement. A town that protected its own. A message delivered in silence, carved into wood and left at midnight. Even today, no one knows who made the dolls or whether the names represented anything real. Some believe they were symbolic. Others think they referenced people who were never publicly identified. The mill still stands at the edge of town, its windows boarded, its fence leaning under the weight of age. Every so often, on cold autumn nights, someone in Ridge Harbor claims they hear a soft knock at their door just past midnight. They check the porch. Usually, there's nothing there. But occasionally, they say the air feels different, as though someone walked away only moments before. The final lingering question remains simple. Were the dolls meant to reveal the truth, or to remind everyone that the truth had never really left? In the end, all that remains are the quiet pieces of a case that never offered simple answers. The dolls stopped, the questions didn't, and Ridge Harbor learned that silence can hold its own kind of truth. For more stories told with this same careful pace, make sure to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel.